I was with the Yardbirds when I first met George, and we were on the Beatles Christmas show.
At 80 years old, Eric Clapton is finally opening up about a friendship that shaped his life and nearly broke it. For years, fans have wondered what really went on between him and George Harrison beyond the music, beyond the smiles and old photos. Was it rivalry? Brotherhood? Something deeper? Clapton's new reflections reveal a side of their bond that few ever saw, the kind that survived love triangles, addictions, and fame's heavy shadow. From late-night jam sessions to moments of painful honesty, what he shares now changes how we remember both men. Stay with us, because this isn't just rock history. It's a story about loyalty, loss, and the kind of love only music can explain.
I think we shared a lot of tastes too, on superficial things, cars or clothes, but and women, obviously. Well, I suppose money, status, the classic things. Beatles.
If you really want to understand what Eric Clapton finally opened up about George Harrison, you have to rewind to where it all started, London in the mid-1960s. The city was alive in a way few places have ever been since. Every pub, every club, every damp basement seemed to vibrate with the sound of guitars, harmonicas, and young musicians trying to push their way into something new. Eric was just 19, a quiet kid with sharp eyes and a Les Paul guitar that he played with more emotion than most singers could put into words. At the time, he was with the Yardbirds, a band that was part blues revival, part raw energy, and that, funny enough, would later give the world names like Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck. George Harrison, just a year older, was already a household name by then. The Beatles were conquering the world, but George was always the quiet one, the one who cared more about his guitar tone than the headlines. He wasn't chasing pop fame like John and Paul. He was chasing sound, chasing feeling. And in that pursuit, his path crossed with Eric's. Not in a studio, not at some red carpet event, but in the small London clubs where the blues ruled. These were the kinds of places where you could walk in and see young British musicians standing shoulder to shoulder with visiting American legends, all of them paying their dues to the sounds of Muddy Waters, B.B. King, and Robert Johnson. Eric once said in an interview from 1989 that George was the Beatle who got it. While the others were experimenting with pop and psychedelia, George was quietly digging into the same records Eric was obsessed with. They bonded over that shared love of the blues, the honesty, the struggle, and the soul behind it. George had started out like any other kid, strumming along to Elvis Presley songs he heard on television, but it was the blues that pulled him in deeper. By the mid-60s, when the Beatles and the Yardbirds were sharing the same concert bills, Eric and George were already trading guitar licks and laughing backstage between sets. There's a story Eric has told more than once about one of those nights. George, with his calm, sly grin, handed him a cigarette and said, "You make that guitar weep like no one else, slow hand." It was the kind of moment that says more than any formal introduction could. From there, they built a friendship that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with music, and maybe a little bit of mutual loneliness. Eric was the too bluesy guitarist who'd just been let go from the Yardbirds for not fitting the pop image. George, meanwhile, was quietly frustrated that so many of his songs were passed over for Lennon and McCartney's. Both of them, in their own ways, felt like outsiders in the worlds they helped build. By the late 60s, that bond grew into something much deeper. George would sometimes escape the chaos of the Beatles by visiting Eric at his home in Surrey. There's a well-known story from the spring of 1969. George showed up after a long, frustrating day dealing with business meetings and record label stuff, and while wandering through Eric's garden, he started humming something. Eric, who was just strumming idly on an acoustic guitar, joined in. Out of that moment came Here Comes the Sun, one of the most hopeful songs in the Beatles' entire catalog. Eric later said, "George had this way of turning pain into light, and you can feel that in every note of that song." But the story that really cemented their connection came around 1968, when George invited Eric to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. At that point, the atmosphere inside the Beatles was tense. Ego clashes, creative differences, all of it. George wanted something to shake things up, something that could make his song stand out. So he called Eric. The producer, George Martin, wasn't thrilled about bringing in someone from outside the Beatles' circle, but Harrison stood firm. Eric's solo that day, run through a Leslie speaker for that swirling, crying tone, ended up becoming one of the most haunting moments on the White Album. And while his name never appeared in the credits, anyone who knew guitars could tell it was him. That session was a turning point for both men. George saw in Eric someone who could express emotion through the instrument in a way he'd always admired. Eric, on the other hand, saw George as the friend who believed in him during a time when he didn't believe in himself. Cream had just fallen apart, and Eric was battling with addiction and self-doubt. George giving him that opportunity was like extending a lifeline. Their connection only grew from there, spilling beyond the studio and into personal life in ways that would later get complicated.
Well, as time goes by, I mean, it's a bit like when you're at war, you stick together, and it's like the old guys now, we do stick together because of all the competition.
Once Eric Clapton and George Harrison found that easy musical chemistry, it didn't take long for them to start popping up in each other's projects, sometimes quietly, other times right in the spotlight. Their friendship had already been built around a shared love of the blues and an instinct for melody. And when the late 1960s rolled around, both men were looking for a new creative direction. George, after years of being somewhat boxed in within the Beatles, started exploring solo work. Around 1968, he put together Wonderwall Music, which was one of the first solo efforts by any Beatle. The album was mainly instrumental, mixing rock and Indian influences, but tucked within those sessions was a track called Sour Milk Sea. It wasn't released under George's name, but instead for another artist, Jackie Lomax. Still, George produced it, wrote it, and brought in friends like Eric Clapton to give it some edge. If you listen closely, that gritty slide guitar tone that cuts through the mix, that's Eric. It was subtle, but it marked the beginning of a musical partnership that would only grow stronger. By 1970, everything was changing. The Beatles were breaking apart, and the tension that had been simmering finally boiled over. George, finally free to express himself fully, released All Things Must Pass, a triple album that spilled over with ideas he'd been saving for years. It's one of those records that doesn't feel like it came from one person. It's massive, emotional, and full of life. Eric was there from the very beginning, helping George shape the sound. They spent long days in the studio layering guitars, experimenting with tones, and working under the famously wild direction of Phil Spector. Even with Spector's wall of sound approach, all those big, echoing arrangements, you can still hear Eric's touch on songs like Isn't It a Pity and Wah Wah. Eric once said in an interview that Wah Wah was George's way of venting his frustration with the endless pressures of being in the Beatles. The song's sharp, biting tone almost mirrors George's emotions at the time, and Eric's playing brought that energy to life. When All Things Must Pass hit the shelves, it was a massive success, selling millions and cementing George as more than just the quiet Beatle. For Eric, being part of that moment meant a lot, not just as a musician, but as a friend helping another artist finally step out of someone else's shadow. Then came the Concert for Bangladesh in 1971, which really showed what their friendship stood for. George organized the concert after talking to Ravi Shankar, who told him about the humanitarian crisis in Bangladesh. Instead of just writing a check, George decided to do something bigger. He called up his friends, Bob Dylan, Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, and of course, Eric Clapton. The concert, held at Madison Square Garden, was groundbreaking. It wasn't just another gig, it was one of the first major benefit concerts in rock history. Eric, however, was in a rough place. He was recovering from addiction and hadn't played live in a long time. In later interviews, he admitted he was terrified to perform, but George encouraged him, reassuring him that everything would be fine. When they walked out together to play, "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," it felt like time froze. The combination of George's smooth slide and Eric's soulful lead created one of the most powerful live moments in rock history. The concert raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for UNICEF and went on to inspire other large-scale charity events years later. Throughout the 70s, their collaboration never really stopped. George's Dark Horse album in 1974 had Eric on rhythm guitar for a few tracks, and their jam sessions often stretched for hours. A few years later, in 1979, George released a self-titled album that again had Eric's fingerprints all over it. Songs like Blow Away and Not Guilty had that blend of warmth and technical precision that defined both artists. They'd sit around in George's studio, jamming for fun, bouncing riffs back and forth. Eric would bring the blues, and George would bring that calm, melodic sensibility. Fast forward to the late 80s, and their friendship was still alive and well. When George made his big comeback with Cloud 9 in 1987, Eric was right there cheering him on. That album, with hits like Got My Mind Set on You, reminded everyone that George still had plenty to say musically. Eric played on a few tracks, adding subtle touches that gave the songs a bit more edge without overpowering them. He often said George had this quiet way of making everyone around him play better, not by pushing, but by creating this relaxed, positive atmosphere in the studio. Their shared history didn't just live in their collaborations, though. You can hear it in the way their styles influenced each other. Eric's Slow Hand album from 1977, which featured hits like Wonderful Tonight and Lay Down Sally, carried some of that laid-back melodic influence he'd absorbed from George. Meanwhile, George's later work continued to show traces of Eric's blues tone, especially in songs like This Is Love and Devil's Radio. And then there's the story behind Something, one of the Beatles' most beloved songs. George said he wrote it for his wife, Pattie Boyd, but it's widely believed that his friendship and musical connection with Eric played a part in shaping the emotion behind it. The irony, of course, is that Pattie would later become the center of one of the most complicated chapters in both men's lives. For now, though, in this part of their journey, it was all about the music, pure creativity, mutual respect, and a bond that seemed unbreakable. But just when it seemed like they'd found creative harmony, things took a turn that would blur the line between friendship, love, and betrayal, setting the stage for one of the most talked about stories in rock history.
The group politic is a tricky one. You know, there was a lot about what he had going, which I envied, and there was a lot about what I had going that he envied.
When people talk about the connection between Eric Clapton and George Harrison, it's almost impossible to skip over the story that sits right in the middle of their friendship, the one involving Pattie Boyd. It's one of those stories that feels like something out of a movie. Fame, friendship, love, heartbreak, and somehow forgiveness at the end of it all. But when you look past the headlines and fan theories, what really stands out is how strangely human it all was. Pattie Boyd was more than just a famous name in rock history. Before she became linked to either of them, she was a model with that unmistakable swinging London charm that defined the mid-60s. She met George on the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964, and by 1966, they were married. She was part of the Beatles' inner circle, the girl who inspired love songs like Something and I Need You. Their relationship looked like a fairy tale from the outside, but life inside that world wasn't simple. Between endless tours, studio sessions, and the chaos that came with being one of the most famous people on the planet, things started to drift. Around that same time, Eric and George were growing closer. Eric, who had become a close friend of George's through their shared love of the blues, started spending more time at Friar Park, George's home. They jammed, they talked about music, and they connected over things that went beyond fame: spirituality, songwriting, and the kind of loneliness that success can't really fix. Somewhere in the middle of that friendship, Eric fell for Patti. He's never really denied it. In fact, he wrote one of the most famous rock love songs in history about it. Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, released in 1970, wasn't just another blues record. It was Eric pouring his heart out in real time. He was deeply in love with a woman who wasn't his, and that mix of passion, guilt, and obsession bled into every note. The song Layla, which featured Duane Allman on slide guitar, was Eric's way of confessing everything he couldn't say out loud. It was loud, desperate, and hauntingly beautiful. Patti later said that when she first heard it, she knew instantly who it was about. The famous story goes that Eric eventually told George the truth, that he was in love with Patti. George's reaction has been told a few different ways over the years, but the version most often repeated has him responding with humor rather than anger. Whether he really said, "You can have her, just don't make me listen to your records," or not, what matters is that the friendship didn't completely fall apart right there. Somehow, they managed to move through it. By 1974, Patti and George had separated, and a few years later, she and Eric got married in 1979. Their relationship lasted for nearly a decade. It had its share of bright moments. They shared a love of photography, travel, and music. But it was also turbulent. Eric was dealing with addiction and the ups and downs of fame, and that put a strain on everything. They eventually split in 1988, but even through that, Patti and George stayed in touch, and Eric and George continued to play music together. What's wild is how forgiving George seemed to be about all of it. Eric has said in interviews and in his autobiography that George was one of the most gracious people he ever knew. There's a story that Eric shared in a guitar player interview from 2025 about a guitar duel they once had at a private event. Instead of fighting over Patti, they joked about it on stage, trading solos like friendly rivals. Eric said George won the round that night and got the bragging rights, while he walked away with a hangover. It's the kind of moment that says more about who they were as people than any tabloid headline could. Even during Eric's darker periods, especially when he was struggling with H and later A, George would show up for him. George had gotten deeply into meditation and Eastern spirituality during his Beatles years, and he'd often talk to Eric about it, encouraging him to find something grounding beyond the chaos of fame. Eric would later say those conversations stayed with him for life. And when George faced his own battles, like his throat cancer diagnosis in the mid-70s, Eric was one of the people who kept in touch and offered support. They were, in a way, each other's safety nets, even when life pulled them in opposite directions. Their bond went beyond music. It became spiritual, almost brotherly. George found peace in Hindu philosophy, while Eric eventually found his own sense of faith through recovery and Christianity. They never tried to convert each other, but they understood what the other was searching for. Eric once said in an interview that whenever they played together, it felt like a kind of prayer, and that's something you can feel when you listen to their collaborations. By the time the 1980s rolled around, their careers had taken different turns. George's Cloud 9 album marked a big comeback, with songs like Got My Mindset on You, while Eric was pushing through creative and personal challenges with Journeyman. Still, they kept crossing paths, in studios, at charity concerts, and in quiet moments off the radar. When George passed away in 2001, Eric helped organize the tribute concert, Concert for George, at the Royal Albert Hall. He played alongside Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Jeff Lynne, and Tom Petty, all people who loved George in their own ways. That show, according to Eric, was one of the hardest and most meaningful performances of his life. In his later years, Eric Clapton has talked about George Harrison with the kind of warmth that only comes from decades of shared history. In his autobiography, he wrote about George as a brother in sound, someone gentle, spiritual, and deeply musical. In a 2025 Yahoo Entertainment feature, a shared 1913 Gibson L1 guitar resurfaced at auction, valued at around $100,000. It was a reminder of how close they once were. "We used to swap that guitar like kids trading comics," Eric laughed. When George passed away in 2001, it hit Eric hard. He later said one of his biggest regrets was not realizing how sick George really was near the end. To honor him, he helped organize the Concert for George in 2002, a tribute packed with emotion, where he performed While My Guitar Gently Weeps alongside Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. Now, at 80, Clapton still talks about those years in interviews and podcasts. He said more than once that both he and George were a little lost back in '68, but music was what kept them steady. There's no drama in his words now, just appreciation. Their friendship, the ups, the envy, the forgiveness, became a lasting lesson in how two artists could challenge and inspire each other without losing respect. Even today, fans still debate who was the greater guitarist, but the truth is, they pushed each other to grow. As Clapton once put it, George was the real deal, quiet thunder. What are your thoughts about Eric and George? Share with us in the comments below. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to get more stories about your favorite.